There are moments in life when the world feels strangely distant, as if you're watching yourself move through it rather than being fully inside it. You wake up, do what's expected, speak when needed, yet something quiet and hollow lingers beneath it all. It's not sadness, it's not exhaustion, it's an emptiness without shape, a silent void that arrives without warning and stays without explanation. People try to describe it as numbness, disconnection, or a lack of purpose, but the truth is far more delicate. Emotional emptiness is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of something unseen, a long-formed echo of unmet needs, muted emotions, or a life lived in survival mode rather than fullness. This is the psychology of that inner void. There comes a moment, often subtle, almost invisible, when you realize something inside you has gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the soft silence of rest, but a quiet that feels hollow. It's the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break down your door or demand attention. Instead, it sneaks in through the small spaces of your daily life, through the routines you repeat without thinking, through the conversations where your mouth moves but your heart doesn't, through the mornings where you wake up and feel like you're returning to a life you're merely maintaining, not living. At first, you don't call it emptiness, you call it being tired, you call it burnout, you call it just going through something. And for a while, that explanation works, but the feeling doesn't leave. You begin to notice that the things that once stirred something in you, excitement, anticipation, curiosity, now feel muted. Not bad, not painful, just flat. It's like someone turned the emotional volume down on your life, and you're left listening to a world that sounds distant, softer, less real. This is the first quiet recognition of emotional emptiness. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like staring at your phone, even though you don't care about anything on it. Sometimes it's scrolling through messages, unable to decide if you want connection or silence. Sometimes it's sitting in a room filled with people and realizing you feel the same as you do alone. You may even start to blame yourself. Maybe I'm lazy. Maybe I'm unmotivated. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe I'm the problem. But emotional emptiness isn't laziness. It's not apathy. It's not a lack of discipline or ambition. It is a quiet, internal shutdown, a pause your mind creates when it's overwhelmed, undernourished, or emotionally exhausted. And most people don't recognize it until much later, because emptiness is subtle. It doesn't hurt loudly like heartbreak. It doesn't shake you like anger. It doesn't flood you like grief. It just sits there, still, weightless, invisible to everyone except you. You begin to feel detached from your own life, as if you're watching yourself from behind a thin glass. You see yourself smile, but it feels like a performance. You hear yourself speak, but the words don't feel anchored to anything real. You're not lifeless. You're just running on a version of autopilot that looks functional from the outside, but feels vacant on the inside. And this is where the confusion begins, because emptiness is not dramatic enough for others to notice. You're still waking up. You're still working. You're still replying to messages and showing up to plans, so the world assumes you're fine. And you try to believe that too. But there's a small, persistent ache, not painful, just present, that reminds you something within has faded. A softness you once had, a spark you once carried, a sense of self that felt rooted, warm, alive. Now it feels like you're living beside yourself instead of inside yourself. This recognition is quiet but profound. It's the moment you realize that the emptiness isn't going away just because you're ignoring it. It's asking to be understood, not feared, not judged, not dismissed. The truth is, emptiness doesn't appear out of nowhere. It forms slowly, quietly, over years of emotional self-abandonment, over the weight of unspoken feelings, over the pressure of living in survival mode for too long. A gentle, silent signal that your inner world needs attention, understanding, and care, and that the story of this void, its origins, its purpose, and its transformation is only just beginning. Emptiness rarely begins in adulthood. It is not something you suddenly develop. It is something quietly shaped over years, through moments you barely remember, through patterns you never realized were forming. The void has a history, And like most emotional histories, it often begins long before you were old enough to name what you were feeling. Some people learn emptiness in childhood, not through dramatic trauma, but through absence, the absence of emotional presence, the absence of being truly seen. You may have had a roof over your head, food on the table, and parents who cared in the only ways they knew how. But care without emotional attunement still leaves a gap. Many children grow up in homes where emotions are inconvenient, where vulnerability is dismissed, where sadness is met with impatience or silence, where the message is subtle but clear. Your feelings are too much. Your needs are overwhelming. Your inner world should stay quiet. So the child adapts. They learn to shrink themselves, to minimize their needs, to numb what they're feeling before someone else tells them to. This is where the void begins, not as emptiness, but as suppressed fullness. Because emptiness isn't the lack of something that should be there. It's the result of repeatedly pushing down something that was there, something deeply human, something that never had space to exist. Another origin lies in chronic emotional over-responsibility. Some people spend their childhood caring for others, a parent who struggled, a family that relied on them, a home where they had to act older than their age. When a child becomes the emotional anchor of a household, they develop a habit of ignoring their own internal world. And over years, ignoring becomes forgetting. Forgetting becomes disconnecting. Disconnecting becomes emptiness. Others learn the void through constant performance. They were rewarded for being the responsible one, the strong one, the quiet one, the gifted one. Roles that required emotional perfection, not emotional honesty. And when you grow up being valued for what you do rather than who you are, you learn to detach from the parts of yourself that don't fit the role. Over time, the self becomes a mask. And masks, no matter how convincing, are lonely to wear. There is also the emptiness that develops from survival mode. Years of stress, instability, or emotional unpredictability teach the body to stay alert rather than open. When you're focused on getting through life rather than experiencing it, the inner world quietly shuts down to conserve energy. The brain becomes efficient at survival, but poor at connection. You stay alive, but you stop feeling alive. And then there is the void created by self-abandonment. The moments when you silenced your intuition to keep the peace. When you stayed in places that dimmed your spirit because leaving was too painful. When you betrayed your own truth out of fear of losing love, approval, or belonging. Each moment leaves a small emptiness, one you promise to deal with later, but later never comes. And the emptiness accumulates layer by layer, year by year. There are many origins, but they all share a common theme. Your emotions had no safe place to exist. So your mind did what it needed to do. It protected you. It softened the intensity. It dimmed the internal noise. It created space where the pain could sit quietly without overwhelming you. And that space, that carefully constructed emotional silence, eventually becomes the void you feel today. Understanding this doesn't immediately fill the emptiness, but it does something more important. It reveals that the void is not your fault. You didn't choose to feel empty. You adapted. You survived. You became who you needed to be. And the emptiness inside you is not a sign of failure. It is the evidence of everything you held together until now. Emptiness often feels like a mystery, a sensation without a clear cause, a heaviness without a story. People describe it as numbness, disconnection, a lack of meaning, or a quiet blankness where emotions once lived. But behind the feeling lies a psychology, both intricate and protective. The void is not random. It is not weakness. It is not the mind malfunctioning. It is the mind defending itself. At the center of emotional emptiness is a phenomenon known as emotional blunting, the brain's way of reducing the intensity of feelings when it believes they're too overwhelming or too costly to process. This mechanism appears in times of chronic stress, prolonged emotional strain, depression, trauma, or unresolved internal conflict. It's the nervous system choosing silence over overload. When the body spends too long in fight or flight states, worrying, anticipating, bracing, it eventually shifts into a third state: freeze. Freeze is not fear, it's not panic. It's a protective shutdown when the system believes it can no longer cope. That shutdown feels like emptiness. In this state, the mind reduces its sensitivity, not because you don't want to feel, but because feeling has been associated with danger, overwhelm, or disappointment. This is why some people describe emptiness as a protective numbness. It's the emotional equivalent of the body going limp to avoid further injury. Another psychological layer behind emptiness is dissociation, a subtle mental distancing from your own inner experience. Not dramatic, not obvious, but more like watching life through a screen. You participate, you respond, you move through your days, but from a slight distance. Dissociation often develops from repeated emotional suppression. Each time you silence what you feel, you take a step away from yourself. Each step creates a small gap. Over years, the gap grows large enough to become the void. There is also the role of reward system depletion. The brain's dopamine pathways, responsible for motivation, pleasure, anticipation, weaken under chronic emotional strain. Activities that once sparked excitement feel flat. Connections that once felt warm feel muted. Life becomes a quiet, grayscale version of what it used to be. This isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of willpower. It's neurobiology. The mind is conserving energy by dimming responses that require too much emotional output. Then comes the psychological phenomenon known as identity diffusion, a fading sense of self caused by too many years spent adapting to external expectations. When you've always been the one adjusting, pleasing, surviving, enduring, you eventually lose track of what you genuinely want, love, or believe. Without a clear sense of inner direction, emptiness fills the space. There's also a quieter truth. Emptiness often replaces emotions that were too painful to feel fully. Sometimes the void is grief that had no room to be expressed. Sometimes it's anger that was never allowed to surface. Sometimes it's sadness that was dismissed or misunderstood. Sometimes it's loneliness carried for so long that your mind gently wrapped it in numbness. And sometimes the void is not an emotion at all, but the absence of connection to yourself. Modern life also shapes the void. Constant stimulation, endless comparison, the speed of expectations, all create an inner environment where genuine emotion can't breathe. When life demands productivity over presence, your inner world becomes secondary. Eventually, the connection with your deeper self grows faint. What feels like emptiness is often distraction-induced emotional starvation. But beneath all the psychological mechanisms, dissociation, emotional blunting, identity diffusion, stress responses, lies one profound insight. Emptiness is a strategy, a quiet coping mechanism, a temporary shield, a way the mind protects the parts of you that once felt too fragile to expose. The void is not a flaw, it is the evidence of resilience. Your mind doing everything it can to keep you functioning when life became too heavy to feel. Understanding this shifts the narrative. The emptiness becomes less of a mystery and more of a message, a signal, a pause, a space waiting to be reclaimed. There comes a moment, gentle, almost unnoticed, when the emptiness stops feeling like a threat and begins to feel like a message. Not loud, not sudden, just a quiet shift inside, as if something long muted finally exhales. This moment rarely arrives as a dramatic breakthrough. It doesn't feel like clarity or confidence. It feels softer than that, like awareness, like the faint recognition that beneath the numbness, something is still alive. For most people, the turning point begins with a subtle discomfort, a feeling that the emptiness is no longer just a shield, but also a longing for connection, for meaning, for a version of themselves they can almost remember but not fully reach. This longing is not a weakness. It is the first sign that the mind is done surviving and ready to start feeling again. But reaching this point often stirs conflict. Part of you wants to feel, to reconnect with emotion, inspiration, and presence. But another part fears what might return with those feelings: old pain, unprocessed grief, unmet needs, memories you learn to silence. This inner tug of war is a normal stage in human psychology. It is the nervous system recalibrating, asking itself whether the world is safe enough to open again. The emptiness becomes the battlefield between the urge to numb and the desire to feel. In this stage, people often notice small contradictions within themselves. They crave closeness but avoid vulnerability. They want meaning but feel too exhausted to search for it. They want to care but struggle to access emotion. This is not inconsistency, it is healing in progress. Because healing does not begin with feeling better, it begins with noticing that you want something more than numbness. And slowly, the void begins to loosen. One of the most profound shifts happens when someone stops treating their emptiness as an enemy and begins to treat it as information, a signal from within, rather than a flaw. This reframes everything. Suddenly, the emptiness is not a failure of emotion, but a reflection of emotional deprivation. Not a personal defect, but a psychological response. This understanding softens the inner resistance. It makes room for compassion for the parts of you that had to shut down to survive, and for the younger versions of you who learned to silence themselves long before you understood why. As compassion grows, something else begins to grow with it, a sense of possibility. Not excitement, not joy, just possibility. Possibility feels like tiny sparks, moments when something matters again, even briefly. Moments when you laugh without forcing it. Moments when music hits you a little deeper. Moments when your chest feels warm instead of hollow. These are signs of re-entry, the psyche finding its way back into aliveness. Soft integration happens gradually. It's not a sudden filling of the void, but a slow weaving of presence back into daily life. Small emotional threads begin reconnecting, a sense of preference, a flicker of intuition, a moment of honesty with yourself. And as these threads grow, the emptiness changes shape. It stops feeling like a hollow space and starts feeling like an open space, a space with depth, room, and quiet potential. Many people describe this stage as finally being able to hear themselves again. Not the noise of expectations, not the echoes of old wounds, but a quieter voice, steady, soft, and honest. This voice does not demand change. It does not push, rush, or pressure. It simply says, "I'm still here." And that realization is the turning point, because the truth is this: the void was never a permanent absence. It was a pause, a protection, a space waiting for your return. When you begin to inhabit yourself again, even in small, imperfect ways, the emptiness becomes less frightening. It becomes less of a void and more of a doorway. A doorway into a deeper self, a quieter self, a self that feels again, slowly, cautiously, truthfully. And with time, the emptiness does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes the place where you learn what you truly needed all along. In the end, emptiness is not the absence you once believed it to be. It is a quiet landscape within you, shaped by everything you carried, everything you lost, and everything you were never allowed to feel. For years it seemed hollow, but now you can see it more clearly. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. It was simply a space waiting for your return, because the void is not a flaw in your design. It is the room your soul creates when it's ready to grow. A silent clearing where old defenses fall away and new beginnings take root. And as you step back into yourself, gently, slowly, truthfully, you realize something you couldn't before. The emptiness was never the end. It was the doorway you were always meant to walk through.